as they always say with content and with life in general, it's better to do things 11 days late than never. So here we go. Subscriber Q&A number 5. I've been meaning to put out... I'm just going to go through a little bit of stuff before I get into the questions, but as always, the stuff is timestamped below. So if you want to skip to a specific question, or if you asked one, if you're one of my Twitch subscribers that get the opportunity to ask me questions which go into these videos from my Discord, then you can check for your name below. But yeah, like I was saying, I was meaning to put out this video 11 days ago and meaning to stream a lot more as well, but it's very difficult actually to fit it into my schedule when I'm working on the Overwatch League. And I knew that would be the case at the beginning, but I'm afraid you're going to just have to bear with me a little bit. I'm trying to figure out ways that I can stream on Mondays and Tuesdays when I'm off, but that's often the times that I want to actually get like adult responsible shit done, and also there are other people that I don't work with that I want to socialize with, and I can only see them when I'm not working, so it can be difficult to fit that in as well. But hopefully we should be getting some more streams up so that I'm streaming 3 times a week. That's the aim, to try and fit of some length three streams a week. Now, something else that I'm also trying to fit in as well, which might end up being ridiculous, I might not be able to fit all of this stuff in, is more regular podcasts. And you can see behind me table and chairs that never used to be there. I just picked them up today. Thank you very much, Mr. X Morello, for helping me with that as well. But, so, table, couple of chairs. I've got some spare chairs as well if I want to integrate more people. And I've got a couple of microphones and a setup. I'll probably be testing that at some point this week. I don't exactly know who, and I don't know whether the podcast itself will go out, because it'll be more to do with checking the logistics and audio setups and stuff like that, and the best way in which to do those kind of podcasts. But hopefully this channel should also have a bunch of in-person live podcasts with players, coaches, talent, production staff as well, if you want to include Jonathan in production staff, though he is one of us, and maybe some other random stuff as well. Not all of them will be Overwatch related, but they'll still all go up on here. But you know, like the stuff like I've been posting about, you know, random stories. I mean, me, Brendan, Jonathan had like a random story podcast that we started last year. We just never got around to posting it, and the audio quality wasn't quite up to scratch, so we wanted to kind of start again and make sure that the quality was good enough for people to actually want to listen to as a podcast. So with that done, that's what's been going on in my life recently, as I scramble to try and actually make use of the fact that all of the players and talent and everything are actually here during 2019 and not scattered across the globe. So hopefully I can actually start making some content before it gets to the middle of the season, but I mean, we're nearly there. All right, so the first question in my subscriber Q&A number 5 on 420. There you go. Fucking blaze it. Or don't. Depends whether it's legal where you're from. Or whether you risk getting caught. Nope, stop, Josh. Pogey asks, who would you pick for a retire... do you know what, as well? I got a lot of very detailed questions. It's taken me like an hour to do the research to be able to answer some of these videos, but I love it. Keep it going. The creativity in some of these questions is great, and it's the kind of shit that me and the casters talk about all the time. Okay, so Pogey asks, who would you pick for a retired player roster? So people that have retired from the game completely, presumably. How do you think it would stand in Overwatch League, assuming they practice and play close to their peaks? Now, I don't know whether you've ever tried to do research on who has retired from the scene. It's actually pretty difficult to be able to find out like who the notable names were back in, you know, yonder days that have retired. So I'm pretty sure I've missed a bunch of people that I'm sure have retired across the years, but I've kind of forgotten. For example, I'm going to start with flex supports, and the only decent flex support that I can think of that like played at a top level and then went on to retire is Chip Cyan. Now, I'm sure I must be missing someone. I must be forgetting somebody, but I don't exactly know who, and having done a bit of research for this question already, I'm not willing to search to the ends of the earth for videos like this. So I think that I would pick Chip Cyan on this role. There's a bunch of other players, obviously, from Tier 2 that ended up retiring and stuff, like Vancouver and Evoke, I think, at some point were a fairly decent support duo. I can't even remember. I think Evoke played flex support at that time. But easily, the one that comes to mind for me is Chip Cyan. And I think that he could be a pretty decent player if he was motivated to play and you know, practiced a lot. The motivation is a huge thing with this team, obviously, with the like sub question, how would it stand in OWL? Because it all comes down to how motivated you are, in my opinion. Okay, for the main support that would go alongside him, the hard support, I'd probably go with Avast. He's the player with the most recent experience in the Overwatch League, a player that's keeping up with everything that's happening, a player that it was motivated to improve, just ended up being stuck on Boston where the scrim system didn't allow for the sister team to really get involved. Other decent options would be Verbo, who, you know, was recently playing with the LA Valiant, but I think Avast was probably better. Verbo perhaps had higher level experience, but never was that impressive. Having said that, was Avast? I don't know. But Avast at least did well enough to be able to get picked up for the Overwatch League and just didn't get any play time, whereas Verbo was deliberately benched as far as I'm aware. Anyway, who knows? Another decent option might be Wins, obviously not the most mechanically gifted or motivated on main support as well, which makes a huge difference. Like, even when Wins was motivated to actually play and get good at the game, he wasn't really motivated at his position, which does, I mean, again, it makes a huge deal whether or not you can be bothered to really invest 100% in your practice and try and make yourself as good as possible on that role. But he is an incredibly intelligent person. On main tank, there's a number of options here, but the one that I'm leaning towards the most would be Christopher. And I'm gonna, retired player, I've gone with Avast, who's obviously gone into casting. I've gone with Christopher, who's gone into coaching the Philadelphia Fusion. But fuck you, it counts. So I'm gonna go with Christopher for this. He played at a pretty decent level, played for the Overwatch World Cup UK team. Looked pretty good there. I feel like I must be missing some other people as well. Another notable candidate was Nox. Was another one that I thought of. But the guy's doing so well coaching that, honestly, I think part of this question, who would I pick for a retired player roster, I'd pick, Nox deserves to be in the Overwatch League, and whether or not it's involved with coaching or whether it would be as like a main tank if he wanted to get back into it. Nox's Winston was good at the time within that meta. How motivated was he to improve on a bunch of different heroes? How good was his Rein? These kind of questions. I think Christopher's the more solid pick overall. So at the moment, we've got Chipsai, Avast, and Christopher. Alongside Christopher on off-tank, I don't believe there's anybody more qualified than Seagull. It seems like Seagull is the easily the most obvious pick for this role. Very talented, was very dedicated at some point in his career, has a very big stream, obviously, and Dallas Fuel, the team that he was playing on, didn't find particularly much success, but he's so intelligent and would be a great asset to this team, and was getting very good on D.Va when he retired. So I have full confidence that he would be able to come back in and actually play that hero to a very, D.Va obviously is what I mean by off-tank. People don't rarely play a bunch of other stuff, but he does have the flexibility to be able to if that was the case. So yeah, I would go with Seagull there, and I think that's probably the best choice. I mean, the others I'm not as confident in because I might have forgotten people, but I'm pretty sure that Seagull would be your retired player on off-tank. Now, as for DPS, you've actually got a bunch of people who would be really good. I mean, Chipsai and Avast. Chipsai in particular, we're kind of dredging a bit at the bottom. He's, the motivation was a big problem for him. He ended up looking beneath a lot of the other people in the Overwatch League. Avast or Verbo or Wins, whoever you pick up for that spot, it's not going to be like an all-star. Same with Christopher. But when you start to get into the off-tank of Seagull and the DPS options, you actually start to realize that this could be a pretty good roster. Again, it all comes down to motivation. But you have players like Effect, who recently retired, who could be a fantastic player with the right coaching behind him, as long as he's able to take it on board, which who knows, and the right what's the right word? The right mentality, but I don't mean that in the sense of a dedication to improve. I mean that in the terms of being comfortable with committing so much time to the Overwatch League while still having a good, while still giving enough care to your own mental health. That seems to have been an issue that really drove him to discard the role of being a player in the Overwatch League. And when you commit that much time and there's so much pressure on you, if you are inclined to take people's comments critically, or inclined to get frustrated if you aren't able to succeed or reach your potential, or any of these other things that can negatively affect your mental health, or just grinding the game all day, you seek other things in your life, all of these things would obviously have to be taken into account. But in a perfect world, Effect's talent was just so fantastic that I would definitely have him on this roster. The same with Dafran. I'd have him on this roster. There are obviously mitigating circumstances, which were why he has retired. But of course, that's the same for a lot of these guys. And nobody can argue that the mechanical skill was not there. In stage 1, okay, he was on Zarya. It took him a while to be able to get up to par. He had some performances that weren't that great and weren't kind of what you would expect from Defran level, because the guy is such a mechanically gifted god on a bunch of different heroes. But he was still incredibly competent, a very good player. And he's pretty intelligent as well. There's a bunch of mentality things to fix in terms of like his attitude and these kind of things, but whatever. It's a fun roster. Mistakes is another guy that I would go for. We saw him play on Boston Uprising last year, and he was a great credit to that team. He was thrown into a role that he wasn't expected to play. He was supposed to be kind of a tracer hit scan specialist, ended up playing a bunch of Junkrat, Genji, Pharah, these kind of heroes that he was never meant to play, and he was still able to put up reasonably good performances. His Sombra was pretty good, he's intelligent, he's got a great work ethic, and I think that the whole experience with the Boston Uprising and the fact that he couldn't find another top team really put him off. So I'd love to see Mistakes return to the game. He's the number one player that I would love to see return to the game out of everybody that I've listed so far. And I think it was a bit of wasted, kind of a poor circumstances for him because of the weird situation that happened with Boston. But I'd love to see Mistakes back, and I'd love to see him on this roster as well. And then the final one is Esker. I thought I'd throw that in for everybody who remembers the struggles of Seoul Dynasty last year when they looked like they were lacking an emotional leader, someone to transfer the role of the coach and team captain into the game to keep them on the right path, to be able to motivate them. Esker's also a very talented player across many different titles, and his Sombra was excellent, genuinely excellent. He got memed on for his Tracer, not the most mechanically gifted Tracer for sure, but if Esker's motivation had been there, and if he was able to play, for example, in a meta like we're in now during GOATs, where it's less about your mechanical skill, more about how you understand the game and the teamwork and keeping everybody on the same page, Esker could have been phenomenal. So I'd love to see this guy return as well. He'd be part of my 4-man DPS lineup. So there you go. How do I think it would stand in OWL? I mean, if everyone, part of the question was if they played close to their peaks. If these guys did play close to their peaks, then you'd have Chip Cyan, who was actually pretty decent. Think in your head where Unco is now, and Unco and Chip Cyan were on a fairly similar level all throughout their past when they were both really motivated to play and improve. So, you might get those kind of performances out of Chip Cyan, which is pretty decent. Avast or Verbo or whatever, they were okay. They're decent. Wouldn't be the worst main support in the league, but certainly wouldn't be the best. Probably somewhere down towards the bottom. Christopher, I think this guy at his peak still had a lot to learn. Is the case with a bunch of different main tanks that have now retired, and a bunch of different European main tanks as well. Somewhere close to the bottom, but certainly not the worst main tank in the league by a long shot. It wouldn't be a feeder for sure. He's a guy that has a lot of potential and is very smart, so I think he'd be okay. Especially with so much Rein in the league. He was always a big fan of playing a lot of Reinhardt. But I think going into coaching was the right move for him. Seagull, fantastic. The DPS, fantastic. Where do I think this team would rank? I think it would be, maybe like a 16th or 17th place team, which is not too bad for a retired played roster. Precoixious asks, there's talk about how GOATS itself is no different to other dominant metas, but rather how the lack of diversity or rock, paper, scissors, and thus having a single dominant comp is boring. People point to the power of ultimates and momentum for the reason teams would rather mirror the strongest comp than swap. Do you agree? And if so, what can be done? Okay, so let's break this question down a little bit. There's talk about how GOATS itself is no different to other dominant metas. I agree with that to some extent. Dive was kind of similar in that there were things that you could do to try and really make it difficult to dive into a team, but the problem often comes down to the fact that even if you have a bunch of compositions in the game that are rock, paper, scissors, and to be fair, we are in a bit of a rock, paper, scissors composition right now. If a team was running Reinhardt GOATS and the map allows for it, you could run some triple DPS, quad DPS composition. But once you win that team fight, and they swap off to something that counters it. Say, for example, dive, or say, for example, it's just Batiste goats, or it's Winston goats, or Winston goats with a Batiste, which no one really plays, but they could against some kind of quad DPS setup. Well, now they've only made a couple of switches. If they switch over to, just Batiste goats, which a bunch of teams do, they've only made one swap. So they've only lost one ult. And they really haven't taken much time or much momentum out of their game. But if you're the team that swapped from goats onto quad DPS and now have to swap back onto a different composition, you've swapped all of your heroes, you've lost all of your momentum, and you've even, and by momentum, I don't just mean ultimate economy, like the fact that you are snowballing towards ults. I mean literally the positioning on the map, because you have to go back and change your heroes. So you either run into them when you know that they have a better composition and lose and feed them ults and give them all of the positioning, or you go back to spawn yourself and give up the advantageous positioning you just got from winning a team fight. Which is why we only really see variation in compositions on assault or hybrid maps, because you only, as the attacking team, only need to win one team fight to be able to take the point, essentially. Sometimes it can be more, obviously, there can be recontests and these kind of things. But in general, one decisive team fight on a map like Paris, on a map like King's Row, for example, what are the on a map like Hanamura, these are essentially one team fight points. And so it changes the game massively compared to Escort or compared to Control. They are fundamentally very, very different. The defense has one goal, which is we must never lose a team fight. The offense has one goal. We must win one decisive team fight. That is not the case at all on Escort or Control. It's all about the momentum and all about being able to keep the snowballs going, keep the ultimates ready, work off advantageous positioning and punishing people who are respawning, these kind of things. So the very large difference in terms of the maps and what's important on each map changes what compositions and even how you can approach things in terms of changing compositions. And then, of course, you have to take into account stuff like map geometry. Can you even run, quad DPS effectively on these points? And the only real escort maps where you see a bunch of quad DPS, like for example Route 66 where it first started, it's really just to break that first forward hold. And the first forward hold is so important and so advantageous for the defensive team who are set up either on big ults or really aggressive, that it's worth just breaking that first deadlock, even if you have to go back to spawn and switch, because it takes, you have such an attacker's advantage in terms of the spawns just right out of the spawn that you can get value out of it. Are there many other maps where that happens? No, not really. So it tends not to have much diversity in the swapping. If there were no ultimates in the game and the game was balanced to have no ultimates in the game, you'd see way more role swaps. You'd see much more diverse metas. But you'd also have a lot of difficulty balancing this game without the ultimates, because part of how people break through choke points or break certain defensive holds is it's all balanced around the ults. So as for what can be done, I think the answer is to have a situation where So GOATS is weird, right? Because not only is it the default kind of is good in a lot of situations comp, but it also has big, powerful ultimates. So if the ultimates are drastically nerfed in GOATS, which would be a terrible balance decision, but I'm just going through it, for the sake of the argument. If the GOATS ultimates were shit, if Grav was just, I don't know, was just a pea shooter and didn't do anything, didn't have any CC, then you wouldn't mind swapping your Zarya off. And it wouldn't be so valuable to keep your person on your Zarya. People don't really mind switching off quad DPS or switching off dive that much, because unless you've got like a big EMP or something like that, it's not so valuable to have, the Dragon Strike or to have the Barrage or these kind of things. They're not that good. But the GOAT's ultimates being so powerful makes people want to stay on that comp instead of swap away from it. But nerfing the ults is not really a viable answer, because things like Earth Shatter and Graviton are just so fundamental to the game. It would be wild to try and balance it in that sense. So what else could be done? You could break the idea of GOATs as the default dominant composition so that it only requires some small swaps to be able to break. Like, for example, if you only had to swap 2 players onto Doomfist Sombra or Pharah Sombra or whatever the anti-goats comp would be, if you were able to break goats reliably just with a slight tweak rather than having to go full quad DPS or something crazy like that, then goats would not become so dominant, because teams would be more happy to swap over to the counter compositions. Because even now the counter comps, I mean, you're not even guaranteed to win the team fight anyway, and then you don't snowball further forwards. So yeah, there's some ideas and understanding hopefully for people about why teams decide not to swap most of the time. Jumpboy88 says, what's your opinion on the need for team houses? For example, Dallas do not have a team house and built their practice facility as an office environment, in part to separate the professional and personal lives of their players. Do you think that will be the trend moving forwards, especially with the home and away games next season, or are team houses here to stay? Now, I'm not sure on the exact numbers involved, but I know that it's... Actually, I shouldn't say I know. I suspect from the little that I do know that it's about half and half split between team houses and apartments. For example, I've been to the Dallas... I've been to the Paris place, and I know of the Dallas place, the Shock place. These guys all use apartments. They have a team house. Like, the Shock has a team house, but it's more of... As far as I understand, it's more that they come to the team house to practice. So that is the work environment, is the team house. Now, there are other teams as well that do live in their houses as, as default, which is teams like the Vancouver Titans. Who else did that? I think Atlanta do that, but I'm not 100%. I think NYXL did that last season. I don't know whether they've swapped. Who else does it? Philadelphia Fusion do it. I wouldn't say that there's really a consensus either way. Even last season, there wasn't a consensus either way. A lot of teams were kind of coming into it thinking, okay, we want our players actually to have a bit of privacy. I can tell you that the way that Paris does it is that they have apartments, but for example, the supports share an apartment, the tanks share an apartment, the DPS share an apartment. So you don't get the loneliness, and when I was talking to some of the players, they actually like being in team houses because it creates that team camaraderie atmosphere. And it can be very lonely to be away from home and be living on your own. I don't mind it personally. I would be quite happy living on my own. But earlier in my life, when I was 18, 19, if I had been living on my own instead of being in like a university atmosphere where you have friends everywhere, and the only people that I was regularly meeting up with were the people that I was working with, because these guys don't really socialize that much outside of their own teams. There's a couple of groups like I think the French players and the UK players and some of the Korean players stick together in different groups outside as well. But broadly speaking, they tend to stick either with their teams or just kind of stay. They either stay within their teams or they just stay with themselves and whoever they happen to be living with. So the team house atmosphere breaks that potential loneliness that can happen. And some of the people that went to Apex and were living in hotel rooms and stuff can definitely speak to that kind of loneliness. If you've ever lived on your own in a foreign country before and you're not too comfortable with the culture or the language, again, can be super lonely and isolating. So I don't know that there's necessarily the best way of doing this. If your team likes a team house, then fair enough, go with the team house. My tendency, if I was running a team, would be to do something like Paris do, where you have that central office where people are perfectly welcome to spend a bunch of their time and will be spending many, many hours during most days scrimming and going through VOD reviews and maybe just chilling out as well, and doing stuff like when you have to talk to sponsors or you have to meet up to be able to arrange something that's happening in the future. So it becomes a central hub for everybody and you can hang out there if you want. But also then having multiple people in apartments where you live with two other of your team or three other of your team, and you live together, and so you have that bit of camaraderie as well. And hell, if you want to live on your own and you're willing to front the extra cash, more than your organization is willing. You know, your organization is willing to pay for a 3-person apartment for everybody. If you want to pay the extra couple of $100 a month to be able to find, you know, a 2-person or a 1-person apartment because that's what suits you more, then go for it. But it can be a bit of a complex issue, but it's not one that I've heard that causes too much strife within the league at the moment, because it seems to be fairly well managed, actually. Okay, here we go. Here's a crazy question. Precoixious asks, who are your Arhans, people who should not be an owl but are, and your Davins, people who should be an owl but aren't? Okay, for starters, toxic question, bloody calling out Arhan immediately. And it does make it actually a little sticky when I get to that, which is why I'm going to address the Davins first. People who should be in... It's the label should is dangerous, because I don't think anyone really knows who should or should not be in owl decisively. Like, should is a word that says someone fucked up. You don't deserve to be there. There's a lot of players in owl that deserve the opportunity, but have failed to live up to that opportunity, I would say. There's a bunch of players in owl that I would replace if I was running the team. But it's a little harsh to say there's players that are, you know, like stealing salary or something. They shouldn't be an owl. They're clearly way below the level. Having said that, I will address some of the people that I would personally look to replace, whether that means cutting them completely from the league or just benching them as well from owl. But like I said, I'll start with my Davins, the people that I think deserve an opportunity in owl. Let me phrase it like that. These are the people that I think deserve an opportunity in owl, and broadly speaking have a good track record as well. That's something that I'm really going to focus on here. Like, not the people who are hot right now in contenders necessarily and are going wild at this very moment, but the people that I think have a storied enough track record and have played well over the course of a long period of time, to the point where you can probably expect good performances from them if you were to add them to an owl team. So first of all, the eponymous Davin, who, I mean, he's missed out on owl so many times now that it's almost comedic, and unfortunately he's missed out on the Atlantic Showdown as well. But the poor guy's very talented, very intelligent, has played in a bunch of different metas, and deserves an opportunity in owl. Just looking at Europe for the beginning, I'd also highlight Hafikul. I think he's been playing D.Va for a long time within the European region and has proved himself over and over again as being a pretty confident and intelligent D.Va player. I think he got a reputation for being either toxic or maybe difficult to work with, but I think that's something that he's really worked on recently. And as far as I can tell, the guy's a pretty stellar teammate at the moment, and the team's having a lot of success. And I think a lot of that, Bren has a saying that you're only as good as your off-tank. And now I don't know whether that's necessarily true, but I think that off-tank is definitely a role that often doesn't get assessed very well. And one of the best metrics of success is not just looking at how a player performs, but looking at how a player performs over a long period of time and whether or not they're able to actually find success and are respected by their peers and this kind of stuff. And Hafikul seems to hit the mark. I think this might be a bit of a controversial one. I don't know whether this is a hot take or not, but the guy seems to be doing really well in contenders right now, and I think Numlock deserves another chance at the Overwatch League. Within the LA Valiant, that sister team was never particularly functional. Finzi and Iziaki, although they're both playing in the Overwatch League now, had visa issues that meant that this team was essentially not playing. When they had that benched sister roster in the LA Valiant. And by the sound of what's going wrong in the LA Valiant this year, it seems like there was a bit of internal strife throughout the entire team anyway. And the fact that they focused on a 6-man roster shouldn't necessarily mean that Numlock was terrible or shit in bed. And the few opportunities that we saw him play in Owl, yeah, he didn't really play that well, but he was playing with a mixed roster that he'd never played with before, because they always had to play kind of space in instead of Finzi. And then also, he just wasn't well practiced. He was super rusty from being on the bench the whole time. Now that we've seen him in contenders, he actually looks pretty good. He looks like he's worked on his play a lot. His Winston's improved. His Rein looks good. Got a good understanding of the meta. He's doing very well with British Hurricane. I think it's reasonable to give this guy another chance in the Overwatch League. Another guy, following the theme of British Hurricane, is Nox, but not as a player. I want to see this guy as an OWL coach. I think he's very talented. I think him and Wins, actually, I'd love to see involved more in the Overwatch League in coaching positions. I think they're both very intelligent players with a lot of history and a lot of good understanding of what makes a top competitive player and what people need to improve on. They got like a holistic approach to it. They're not just tunnel visioned in on strategy or certain roles or some certain style of how to play the game. They come from that kind of storied competitive background where they're going to be able to help your team on a holistic level. Okay, maybe another hot take here, because I know that this guy was not well talked about when he was in the Overwatch League, but I think Zuppe has been pretty impressive whenever I've watched Giganti play. Since he went to play in Contenders, as you might expect from somebody who was at the top of the Contenders level, then went up to the Overwatch League, then dropped back down to the Contenders level, he's still really fucking good at the Contenders level. Does that necessarily mean that he would be really good in Overwatch League? I don't know, but I don't think that he was necessarily the problem in that Florida Mayhem roster. I don't think he was well supported. The team didn't know how to peel for him. He wasn't putting up big numbers for sure. He actually had some of the worst stats in the entire league. But how much of that was him and how much of that was the failing system of the Florida Mayhem? I think it's pretty hard to tell. And when you consider that there's a bunch of players from the Contenders level, Kodak, Reaper, Dogman, who else? Gray, Heap. These guys all came in ahead of Zuppe in 2019. I think Zuppe is on the level of these guys, and with a decent team system, I think that Zuppe could be at the same level as some of those players. And also is pretty flexible in the roles that he plays. You know, he's got a good Ana, he's got a good Zen, he can play a bunch of different stuff. So yeah, I think that he's deserving of another opportunity, much like Numlocked. Keeping on the European theme, I'd like to see Lulsish. I think Lulsish is an interesting character, has been around for a long time in the Swedish scene, normally paired up alongside Elevote, who I also think deserves an opportunity in the Overwatch League as well. You know, doesn't necessarily have to be a duo. They've been split up for a while now, and it's still going fairly well for both of them. My caveat is often with these European players that I don't exactly know how they'll work on a bunch of other main tanks other than Rein. And for Lulsish as well, that might be the case. And also, the guy doesn't have experience outside of playing within that one team at the top level that plays that one style. So, but I still think that he's had enough success in Contenders and proven himself to be a top talent, playing that style, that he's worth taking a punt on in the similar sense as Ben Best. And I would put him above Ben Best when I was watching them last season. So, you know, if Ben Best is good enough to deserve a spot in OWL, particularly in this meta, then I think Lulsish would have been a decent guy to have a punt on as well. Spectral, who used to be known as Oni God, is actually a pretty fucking good player too. Now, the weird thing about Spectral, who I'm not sure that he should have changed his name, okay, whatever, is his hero pool. He plays a very good Zarya, and he plays a very good Widowmaker, and he plays a bunch of other stuff kind of surrounding that. But in my opinion, nothing's really quite at the same level of his Zarya and his Widowmaker. And there's a bunch of people in the Overwatch League that play Zarya Widowmaker. Guys like Happy is the first one that springs to mind. Who else plays this? There's tons. Why is my mind gone blank? Whatever. Anyway, you get the point. I suppose Fletter, but Fletter plays a bunch of different stuff. Anyway, with potentially Baby Bear, I suppose, with a slightly condensed hero pool, I'd like to see him expand that hero pool and start to get better on a bunch of other stuff. But at the moment, there's not really an argument for him to be playing anything other than what he currently does. And it's not like he's underperforming massively on a bunch of other stuff. It's just that it would be awesome if the other heroes that he had were up to that same level. And then I think he'd be just a straight fire pickup for teams. Another guy with a slightly condensed, reduced hero pool, but has been popping off on Zarya for a long time and is also a really strong McCree and hitscan aimer in general, I think, is Hardest, a French player that used to play with Gamers Origin and now plays for Samsung Morningstar in Europe. this guy would be a great pickup for one of the teams in the league right now that is struggling and doesn't have a Zarya that's very comfortable with playing the current meta. How long is the meta going to last for? How long is Zarya is really relevant? Who knows? If that drops out, then perhaps he's not as useful as he would have been previously. But for the moment, at least, he's a very reasonable pickup for some of the teams that are struggling. Now we start to divulge away from the European scene. So somebody that I think should be picked up and could be picked up actually pretty shortly, which I'll get to in a later question as to the specifics, but Bernard, who plays with the Philadelphia Fusion, who's their off-tank, and he's not super well known outside of the contenders scene, I think. He doesn't have that much respect or kind of a big name, but he's been playing in the scene for a hell of a long time, and he's actually quietly very successful, especially with the Philadelphia Fusion. And the guy actually plays a pretty good game. And off-tank is one of those roles where you need somebody that is really comfortable on it. And there's no point picking up somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience on the role or hasn't at least shown that they're pretty capable with it in contenders. So for a bunch of the teams at the bottom right now who are struggling with that off-tank position, Bernard could be a good pickup. Obviously, there's also Logix. The guy was in the league last year. We all know that he's got a nutty hit scan. If hit scan comes back, he's one of the best in the world at being able to play stuff like that. Was he in a terrible system? Absolutely yes. Is he still a good player? I believe so, yes. He's still got a very good tracer, very good Widowmaker, very good soldier, very good McCree. All of these kind of things he's super good at. His attitude and motivation to actually just knuckling down and being, trying to become the best in the fucking world. I don't know whether that is totally there, but he has the potential to be able to do it. So if he was on the right team with the right players, maybe that would suddenly unlock and you'd see him like really fucking grind to be the best in the world. Because the guy's individual mechanical skill is super good. Panka is another guy. I mean, actually, I'm not even going to say Panka. I'm going to remove him, scratch him from the list, because he is a two-way player for the Gladiators as well. But I think this guy's got enough talent that he could maybe earn a starting spot on another team. So, getting through a couple of other ones. I've got a lot of players to talk about here. Shax, I think, is a really good shout for a player that should be picked up at the moment or could be picked up. He looks like he has a lot of potential, a lot of raw skill. He was pounding when he was in the European division, gone over to NA. I haven't watched as many of his games when he's been in NA, but recently with his team doing so well, I've caught him a couple of times and seems to be doing fantastically over there too. So player with a bunch of potential and the kind of person that has risen fairly quickly while still having enough resume behind him to be fairly confident that you can get good performances out of him regularly. So I'd keep my eye on him. Mangachu as well, honestly, because the guy plays a bunch of weird heroes, but I'm surprised nobody took a punt on him this year. I'm surprised that nobody thought, okay, what happens if Pharah or Junkrat or Torb or any of these weird heroes becomes meta, or if we want a composition that works well around one of those heroes. And Mangachu is pretty flexible. He's pretty talented. He's pretty intelligent. He isn't crazy in terms of being able to play a bunch of default heroes that people would consider kind of default. But he's a weird guy. He plays weird shit, and that is also pretty useful to have at least on the bench. So I was surprised in 2019 that Mangachu didn't get picked up, actually. I thought a team would have, a spot where they thought that he would be valuable to them. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk about some Korean players here, but a lot of the Korean scene, the best players are underage. And the same for China as well, actually. It's weird in that, in fact, I didn't even check for a bunch of these players from Europe and NA because I just assumed they were. But maybe I've just listed a bunch of players who aren't 18 there as well. But when I was looking at China and Korea, I was looking at scrolling through a bunch of these players, and a huge amount of them are underage. I mean, almost every player that you would want to pick up into OWL from Korea, or who is Korean and currently doesn't play in Korea, guys like Nice and stuff, and Alarm, they are all about to come of age next year or the year after, or some of them the year after that. I mean, some of these players that are the best in contenders, and I mean that like over the whole of contenders, not just contenders career, are like 16 years old. It's nuts. But okay, some players that are actually of age that would be able to be added to OWL right now. Gangnam Jin, who plays the Zenyatta most of the time for Runaway, is really talented. I think this guy has got a bunch of potential, and if you give him a bit more time, he hasn't really been playing at the top level for that long, and he already looks good. So given more time, I don't really want to say more, like a better team or better infrastructure or anything, because I think Runaway's actually got really good infrastructure. I think it's literally just a matter of time before this guy would be able to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the other developing talents. I mean, he's in the same position right now that people like Shu, people like Violet, people like Izayaki, Aim God were in when they were playing in contenders, and then they come into OWL and they look sick. So Gangnam Jin, I big fan. On Runaway as well, QOQ, who I think is actually the only other of age player on Runaway. But QOQ has a good understanding of how to play Diva within 3-3. Doesn't have that much experience on top teams outside of Runaway, but I think the Runaway players have proven themselves at this point because they've had so much success over the course of their tenure together. And QOQ has impressed me. He's got great bomb placement, good mechanics. He's something I look at a lot when I measure Diva players is like how fast they are to see opportunities. The best Diva players, like when I watch Fury, when I watch Janu, when I watch Cheobin, when I watch Dako as well, they are always doing something. They're never just stud around. They see this, they see that, they spot like, oh, I could improve my positioning. Oh, I could harass this guy. Oh, this is a good time to do this. Oh, I should save this, in fact, so because it'll be useful later, but still get value in a different way. And he seems to have that kind of decisive, intuitive understanding of what to be doing in each situation. Another guy that I really like from Element Mystic actually is Doha, who played the Sombra for them and plays, plays the Brig and some other stuff. But I was impressed with him as much as you can be for someone that's always, or not always, but tends to be stuck on Brigitte. But when I saw flashes of these other heroes as well, particularly the Sombra, he seems like a player that's pretty decent. So at the very least, I'd try and reach out to trial this guy and see if he's capable for one of these spots. But there's a lot of people in the league right now who aren't that good on Brig and can't flex over away from it if you would need that to be the case in future metas as well. So I've very firmly got my eye on Doha from Element Mystic, along with all of their underage players that they've got on that team and newer players that haven't proven themselves as much. The last guy that I'm going to talk about is Climax, who we heard from the Toronto Defiant. The Toronto Defiant were thinking of picking him up alongside Ivy, I think. Was it the Toronto Defiant? I think so. Said something about the fact that Climax and Ivy were both kind of all aim, no brain. But there's a bunch of teams in the league right now that could do with a hit scan who's all aim, no brain, and try and teach him the brain component. If we go into a hit scan meta, teams like even the Boston Uprising, even though colourhex can play Widow, they don't really have that guy who plays the Tracer and the McCree and the Soldier and all of those things. So Climax could be a good shout for a bunch of those teams who are lacking. Now, the Arhans of the league. And remember, Arhans in the question was defined as should not be in OWL, but are. I'm going to change the definition slightly. These are the players that I think have underperformed in OWL to the point where if I was running their team, I would be considering replacing them. And for some of these guys, they're already on the bench. So what I mean by that is they are kind of... I would be looking to free up that spot next year to bring somebody else in that adds more value to the team. But some of these guys I would just move down to the bench or consider maybe whether they add something that's outside of their gameplay. So, along with the obvious example, the eponymous Arhan, who really hasn't added much to the Houston Outlaws since he arrived, but they have started to integrate him a bit more now. It was always a weird choice. I mean, the thing with Arhan was always you're adding a Korean into a team that doesn't speak Korean, apart from Taerong, And I get the feeling, though, that Arhan was added more for his strategic, like, as somebody to bounce ideas off for Taerong, because he's played with him, or under him, rather, for a long time. I get the feeling that it wasn't so much that Arhan was supposed to be, like, this star player that they brought in. It's interesting that they're involving him more into the team, but his brig hasn't looked particularly good, and they run him on that, like, kind of cheesy Torb comp, which works very well. But I get the feeling that almost anybody would be able to run the Torb in that composition, because it's not like the Torb has much to do. He's more the bait, so it's more about just playing smart with it. But perhaps it's his composition, you know. Maybe Arhan came up with that, I'm not sure. But okay, you know, if I was going to pick someone, I wouldn't have even picked Arhan to be the eponymous name of this category. But okay, there you go. Here's a bit of a meme. Now, I think another player that a lot of people would lump into this category immediately is Tvik. He's not had success for a long time, more than a year and a half of having absolutely no success after being, at one point, genuinely the best player in the world. And I don't think that that was an overstatement at the time in 2016. Now, I would be hesitant to lump Tvik into this group of players that I think don't deserve their spot in Owl, or you know, would seriously have to fight for a spot in Owl over newcomers that would be coming into the league. The reason that I think this is that I think Tvik might still be redeemable. I'm not convinced on it either way, but as a team leader involved in Team Sweden, involved in Florida Mayhem, I don't think he makes good decisions. I don't think that he's the natural type of person that should be leading a team, that should have so much say in the strategy that goes into it and how the team is built and this kind of stuff. But I do think that he's very mechanically gifted. And if he's underneath somebody that he respects, and if he's got the attitude and the humility to be able to accept that role on a team, having been a team leader, if he's able to come into another team and just be another piece, another part of the puzzle that isn't the guy running the show, that isn't trying to make the calls in game and explain strategy to people and this kind of stuff, then I feel like there could still be some length to Tvik's career. I don't think he's totally washed up yet, but it would all come down to how willing he was to play ball in that scenario, and even then it might not work out. From the Florida Mayhem, I've been pretty vocal about this for a while, even last year as well, was that I'm not a big fan of Zephyr. I think that frequently he makes game-losing mistakes, and the best that I saw from Zephyr was in their recent match, hell, I can't even remember who it was against, where he played a bunch of Zarya, and his Zarya actually looked pretty decent. And he's fairly flexible. He can also play the Pharah, and obviously he's got his Diva. And I've seen him on some other stuff as well, but I can't exactly remember right now what he was playing. But I don't think he really adds that much to this team. And unfortunately, am I right in saying this? He's the only off-tank for the Florida Mayhem. I think I'm right in saying that, right? Oh, well, yeah, they have McGravy, but they're not going to run McGravy because they want Korean communication. So I think at the very least you have to sign someone to replace him in the starting roster. I think if you want to be at least challenging for the mid-table, then you can't do that with Zephyr on the starting roster the whole time, I think. So I would like to see him benched, maybe work on his play. Maybe you input him when you need a bit more flexibility from that off-tank role. Maybe you input him when you want to run more Sombra Goats so that he can flex over to the Zarya, because he actually looked pretty competent doing that. But his Diva, he just makes too many mistakes, man. Too many mistakes. SNT is another guy that I think is in a similar position. I would have put Swan in here as well, but actually, since the communication has been improved on the Florida Mayhem, Swan has gone from somebody that I thought was just, you know, almost irredeemable, a bit like some of the other players that I'm going to mention. But he's looked like, now that the communication and teamwork has improved on this team, he's starting to get into the swing of things slightly. I can see sometimes that he's doing the right plays and making, you know, good plays for his team. Whereas that was not there at all when it was a mixed roster, even though they were presumably communicating a bunch of them in Korean as well. So I'm not going to include Swan on this list, but I would like to see them move Swan to the bench and hire a really good main tank, because I think the tank line definitely needs to be improved for Florida. I think they're in a position where they need to make drastic changes. But I don't think that Swan is a player that should not be an Owl. But I think SNT, who was known as Awesome Guy last year, was actually continued to be one of the worst performing main tanks. Again, the system wasn't good for him, but if you've already got Swan on the bench and you're going to hire somebody else, then I think you drop SNT. Of the two of them, clearly the team has decided to go with Swan, but in my world, if I was the GM of this team, I'm afraid I would be hiring somebody for that main tank spot above them both, and that kind of necessitates dropping one of them back down into contenders, and I think that would be SNT for me. Now, I'm sure this is going to annoy a lot of people, but I think the Houston Outlaws have got some of the lowest individual skill out of many of the teams in the league. And so there's a bunch of, not a bunch actually, but there's a couple of potential candidates here for players that individually maybe shouldn't. Again, that's not the right definition, but it's like they aren't as individually talented as a lot of contenders players that could replace them. I think that's the crux of it, right? It's like, you can't justify a position on an Overwatch League team if there's 5 people in contenders that would be better at your spot. But when it comes to the Houston Outlaws, for guys like Raucus and Boink, perhaps, that aren't as individually mechanically gifted and look out of place at times, and I could think of a bunch of contenders players that individually would be able to replace them. The question with the Outlaws is, Outlaws do play better than the sum of their parts. I think that's undeniable. The sum of their parts is not good. The scouting for this team was weird, and yet they still actually managed to put up decent results. I think they're 3-6 at the moment, which isn't great, but they had very close games against a bunch of teams. And last year they finished kind of, what was it? It was just underneath mid-table because they nearly managed to sneak into the playoffs. So clearly there's something going well with this team that allows them to play better than they should be able to play with the talent that's on the roster. So I think lumping guys like Raucus and Boink into this conversation would be a mistake, because even though they could replace them with much better players, honestly, let's be reasonable. You could replace Raucus and Boink with much better individually talented players. Would it be an overall upgrade for the team? Probably yes, but they'd lose something as well. They really would. They'd lose some of the leadership or communication or teamwork or fucking black magic. I don't know what the Houston Outlaws runs on, but there is something there with this team. And I don't know whether even they really know what it is, but something about the good atmosphere that they have in the team, the tight camaraderie that they have in the team as well, the very much us and them mentality would be broken, I think, and maybe they'd perform worse if they had upgrades on the support line. And the reason that I named the support line is that I think it is actually the weakest component of their team. You know, like Dante, Linksa, these guys can carry the DPS component. Muma's Orisa is genuinely like a top 5 Orisa within the league. I'll go on record stating that. His Wrecking Ball is pretty good as well, but we haven't seen too much of it. And his Reinhardt can be fairly clutch at times. His Rein and his Winston, you know, they aren't that great, but okay, the guy's pretty competent. Same with Coolmat. Okay, moving on. From the Washington Justice, I've got a ton, because I think this team was... I know a bunch of people that actually disagree with me on this. I was having this argument with Wolf recently, where it's his opinion, and I think... No, sorry, Hex has the same opinion for the Mayhem. But both of those guys, for their respective teams, believe that the scouting wasn't done particularly badly for this team. It's just the way that they... Wait, what did they say? It's like they have talent on the team, but it was put together poorly. That's the way that they phrase it. So like there are talented pieces on the team, but there are also some bad pieces, and the way that it meshes together is very poor. Now, I don't hold that opinion. I hold the opinion that the scouting for the Florida Mayhem and also the Washington Justice was very poor, and could have been done a lot better. And we don't exactly know who is responsible for both of those, but I think it's quite clear, actually, that you could have done a much better job at scouting talent. I'm not big on Sansam. I think that if I was to make improvements to the Washington Justice, I would be looking at the off-tank position a little like Zephyr. Do I think he's as bad as Zephyr? No, I don't think so, actually. Because he doesn't make mistakes that actually lose you maps. Like, Zephyr tends to feed or get caught out of position in ways that lose you a team fight guaranteed and sometimes lose you a map. Sansam it's like with the whole of the Washington Justice. They tend not to feed. They just don't do anything. So Sansam isn't the greatest, but he's not going to actively lose you games. You do eventually lose by virtue of not doing the right thing, but you don't immediately fail. The backline of Hyonu and Kha'Zix, I don't think adds anything to this team at the moment, especially with Ark and Sleepy. Are they ever going to see playtime? No, they're not. Were they good acquisitions in the first place? I would argue not. I think there were better choices that you would have been able to get for this position. And whether Kha'Zix was playing the main support and was going to call in that position, if Kha'Zix had been brought into call, then he should have been brought into call. And he wasn't, and therefore he's not useful on this roster. Does Kha'Zix deserve an opportunity on another Owl team? He wouldn't be the top of my list. I wouldn't necessarily, even if he was playing contenders, I think, have him in my Davins list, but he deserves another opportunity, honestly, to prove himself in contenders. It would be better for Kha'Zix to be in contenders than be an Owl at this point in time. And Hyonu, I've honestly not been that high on for a long time. And what does he add to this roster? Not much. At the very least, I think he should be benched. Because when are they going to run anybody but Ark? Stratus is an interesting one, because Stratus, it looks like they don't have any idea of what they want to do with this guy. He was like a... I think of him and Blase a little bit similarly. Like, Stratus to me is like a downgraded Blase or something. I don't know. I didn't watch too much of this guy, honestly, in contenders, because he didn't stand out to me. He didn't seem like the kind of talent that would make its way into the Overwatch League. I didn't see that much potential in this guy. And he hasn't been given an opportunity, really, to realize whatever potential they saw him in him in the first place. Again, he's somebody that I think would genuinely benefit from going down to contenders and proving himself, and people recognizing his talents more, if he indeed does have them, and to be able to find his way into another team where they're utilized better. I mean, he was played on fucking flex support, for God's sake, the last time we saw him, because for some reason, apparently Guido is public enemy number one in this team and just gets, I don't know, the shit end of the stick a lot of the time. So yeah, there's a bunch of players that I think in the Washington Justice would actually benefit from going down to contenders. And then the Dallas Fuel is an interesting one as well, because Dallas have a bunch of players on the roster that I don't think are adding anything to the roster, but I don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. Mickey is the one that comes to mind immediately. I don't know what this guy does for the Dallas Fuel behind the scenes. Maybe he's a great motivational leader. Maybe they'd want to keep him on, because he's so popular and because he engages very well with the Thai market, because he's the embodiment of being stuck in a region that nobody really cares that much about and actually making it to the big time. In terms of his in-game performance, though, I don't think you'll ever see him run for the Dallas Fuel. People like Taimu, for example, actually might see game time. I think if Taimu ended up, being super motivated and finding a meta that worked well for him, I could definitely see him getting game time, especially with Effect out of the lineup now. He's competing with AKM, but Taimu's had times in the past where his Hog was fantastic, his Widow was fantastic, his McCree was fantastic. Now, yes, he is kind of in direct competition with AKM on a bunch of those heroes. Not really the Hog, but a lot of other stuff. And AKM seems to be, has that very disciplined mentality and knows how to improve and is very intelligent and doesn't seem to struggle with mental health in the same way that Taimu does as well, which I think can be an issue for him. Not that that's his fault, of course, but it's like always something that might, not always, but it's certainly a hurdle that I think Taimu's going to have to overcome for him to be able to return to like his peak in the past. And I fucking hope he does as well, because I love Taimu. But yeah, so Taimu I wouldn't have in this conversation. That's the point I was trying to make. But for Mickey and potentially Harry Hook as well, actually, I can't really see that many situations where I would see much playtime or much value that they add to the roster. Now, it's very possible that these guys do add actually a bunch of value to the roster, like I was talking about with Mickey, but like maybe Harry Hook's a big input on the VOD review sessions behind the scenes, which I think Taimu actually does quite a bit of. I see Taimu tweeting about stuff all the time, so it's clear that he actually keeps up with the games a lot. And I know that Harry was replying to one of my tweets where I was bigging up OG as well. So clearly Harry Hook's in some sense invested with it. I haven't really seen anything from Mickey, which is why I threw his name into the hat first. But also just the identity of the Dallas Fuel was very much built around Harry Hook, around Taimu, around, Mickey once he came in late 2016. So again, I'm not necessarily saying that they shouldn't be in the Overwatch League, but the way that I took this question is more, who do I feel doesn't really add value when they're on that roster? And again, value is very subjective. For a lot of teams, I mean, even for Houston, for example, even if they don't win every game, their roster might still be super valuable because they're very popular, because they're very marketable, because they have a huge fan base that kind of gets behind seeing the ups and downs and the struggles and the trials and the tribulations. So you could still have a really valuable roster that doesn't just dominate all the times, and still have very valuable players that don't. But I thought it was an interesting question, so I did my best to answer it whilst still trying not to just shit on players, Okay, Env187 says, why did Boston sign Persia? Do they really need 4 support players? I love this question because it just is like a classic fan question, I think, that of somebody that doesn't quite understand how Boston works. And I'm not saying that I know exactly how Boston works, but the evidence is all there before you. Boston is a farm team. They have got the best scouts in the world. Whoever is doing that scouting, whether it's Huck or whether it's Shake or whether it's Gumba or whether they've got somebody else on the team like Mr. Bleeple who goes through a bunch of stats and finds people, I don't fucking know. But somebody on that team is doing a great job, comparable with Runaway, of being able to scout. Although maybe more impressive than Runaway, because people aren't clamoring to sign with Boston Uprising. They have to go out and seek the talent themselves. So in the specific case of Persia, I think, as history repeats itself, what I'm predicting to happen is that they'll try and integrate Persia into the lineup a little bit. They've clearly seen that the guy's got a bit of talent. They'll try and integrate him in, maybe match playtime alongside Aim God towards the end of the season, or in games where it doesn't matter as much. Give him that experience, build him up, make sure that he can become a competent player for them, and then they'll try and sell Aim God, because Aim God's a fantastically talented player. Fragging ability through the roof, really good. He's not standing out as much this season as he could have done last season, because there's a bunch of really good players. I mean, we had Shu, Twilight, and Violet all joined the league this year, and all 3 of those guys are phenomenally good flex supports, whereas previously we really only had Jonak, then Badoshin, and then it was like Neko and Aim God. So Aim God isn't going to stand out as much, but there's still a lot of teams that could benefit and would pay a good price, I think, for Aim God because he's that talented, and they respect Boston Uprising's scouting ability, because a lot of the guys that Boston sell end up being fantastic players because they've developed them into fantastic players. So it's not so much that Boston need 4 support players, it's that I think Aim God at some point, maybe towards the end of the season, after he's had this good run with Boston, after maybe he helps Boston get to the playoffs, I think they'll try and sell Aim God and get value out of him in that way and bring up Persia. And before people get I know that people, for some reason, hate this idea of people selling players as if they're commodities. I mean, they literally are, in that sense, commodities to be bought and sold, in terms of, your work. Your work is to be bought and sold, not the person, obviously. But I think fans generally dislike that from the Boston Uprising. I think people are starting to respect it more now. But I know that people really didn't like it when they sold Note, for example. But what was my point with this? I've fucking forgotten my point. What was I going to say? People don't like it, but, I so rarely lose track of what I'm going to talk about, which is a fucking miracle. But it's totally gone out of my head. Right, well, that's that point gone. It was a fucking good point as well, and it's just vamoosed out of my head. Alright, oh, that was what I was going to say. Okay, so even though fans don't like it as much because it ruins the identity somewhat, like, of the Boston Uprising. They change all the time, so they're a bit of a changing team. It's super good for the league. Like, don't give Boston any fucking hate for doing this shit, because it's so good for the league. They are a team that is literally taking Contenders players and turning them into really good OWL players. Who the fuck else is doing that? Anyone else doing that? Hello? Anyone? Anyone else out here taking really, like, completing the fucking step from Path to Pro to the Overwatch League? Just Boston then. All right, great. Boston are one of the pieces that makes the Path to Pro work, and I you know, it takes a special level of scouting, but I'm glad that they're there to do it, and I really respect them for it. Well, thank God I got that point. Ford says, do you think more and more teams like Mayhem shutting their doors to non-Koreans, or non-Korean speakers, it should be, really. I suppose if anyone was able to speak Korean, they would. It's not that they're, you know, nationalistic. They just want everybody to speak the same language. So, do you think more and more teams like Mayhem shutting their door to non-Korean speakers is detrimental to the longevity of OWL? Or will it be worth it in the end if the level of play is increased? Well, let's tackle the premise, I think. More and more teams like Mayhem shutting their doors to non-Korean speakers. There are currently 7 Korean-speaking teams in the league, plus the Spark, who aren't... I mean, they haven't shut their doors to non-Koreans or non-Korean speakers, and they've made it work, but they're kind of a majority Korean-speaking, and I don't really know what they do. But it's basically 7. And then you also have Chengdu as well, who fall into the same category because they exclude people based on the, you know, having to speak Mandarin, but it doesn't really make sense because there's so many Chinese players and China doesn't in any sense dominate the league in terms of the amount of players involved. So let's discard Spark and Chengdu. You have these 7 Korean speaking teams, and 7 teams that I think personally from the outside would be reluctant to add English speaking or, you know, Chinese speaking or whatever players into their lineups, because it would mean a shift in communication, and that's a perfectly valid reason for not doing it. But let's think about this for a moment. There's 7 Korean speaking teams, but I think am I right in saying this? This might be total bullshit, but I think it's right. I'm pretty sure I saw a stat at the beginning of this league that said over half the players in the league are Korean. Where would I even find this? I just want to fact check that very quickly, as much as I can tell. I mean, how the hell would I even check? Wikipedia Overwatch and then try to go to players or something? Oh, crap. I don't even know how to use Wikipedia. Here we go. All right, if we go to players, Overwatch League players. Damn it, we're not going to be able to tell. I mean, just scrolling through it, it seems like it. I think it's about half. No, it can't be half. Wait, no, it might be. Okay, fuck it. I don't know. I read somewhere, I think, that there was about half of the players in the league. Maybe like 45%. Oh, fucking, I don't know. Anyway, it's more than the proportion of the teams. 7 out of 20 teams speak primarily Korean, right? So that's 35%, which is about a third, right? Let's call it a third. I'm pretty sure that more than a third of the players in the league are Korean. So it's not like the fact that you have a bunch of Koreans in the league, or not a bunch, but the fact that you have so many fantastic Korean players in the league does not necessarily mean that you are going to have a bunch of Korean-speaking teams at the same proportion. And that doesn't mean that you are closing the door to non-Korean players at the same proportion. Most of the time, Korean-speaking players are going to be more highly valued if they can speak other languages, and that even then allows you to open the doors in the future. But I suspect the point of this question really is having so many totally Korean teams detrimental to the marketing of OWL? I suppose that's the question really, is the longevity is tied to how much people at home are really involved in it. There's a bunch of other things that come into it. For example, the fact that you need to have the fresh flow of talent coming in all the time because people are going to retire or people are going to drop off, and you need to keep the level of play increasing. But at the crux of the question would the longevity of the league suffer with this level of majority Korean teams? I don't think so. I don't think so. For example, Vancouver Titans, incredibly fun team, amazing personalities, one of the largest fan bases in the whole of the Overwatch League. Full Korean team. They don't even speak English in interviews. But it doesn't matter, because the marketing aspect of it isn't really the language. It's their personalities. And the question is whether those personalities can cross the cultural barrier and cross the language barrier and be able to resonate with people. Do the stories of the players, do their performances in game, do the personalities of the players transcend that cultural and language gap to be able to resonate with the primary audiences? Now, the primary audience isn't Korean. The primary audience is English speaking and Chinese speaking, right? So that's another key distinction, is that there's a lot of the audience that's Chinese speaking. Do they vibe with the Korean teams more than the English speaking teams? I actually have no idea. And I have no idea of even how to investigate that, because I'm not culturally Chinese. I have no basis on which to make even an assumption about whether they would or not. I think the more Chinese teams that are in the league, the more you probably appease that audience. But again, that might just be very reductive of me, assuming that Chinese audiences like Chinese teams. I mean, it seems reasonable, but is it true? Who knows? It's very possible that the Chinese community also really likes the teams that are, bold and outspoken, or maybe they like the meek and quiet because it fits with whatever they value more. You know what I mean? Speaking from the point of view as a Western audience, which is the person that submitted this question as well, and I'm sure is the majority of my viewers, the teams that I like to watch are the teams that have a style to them, have personality, have swagger. I fucking love watching London Spitfire recently because Gesture is a fucking boss and profits like this little god Twiglet man that destroys everybody. I don't think that I struggle at all to identify with the London Spitfire, especially recently, because Gesture's come more out of his shell and understood English more to the point where he can let his kind of swagger personality show a lot. Same with the Titans, same with NYXL as well. I have no issues. I don't feel estranged from NYXL at all because they're Korean speaking. Their English is coming on a lot. They have great personalities, very wholesome feel to them, very family feel, and also that little bit of like swagger and trash talk from guys like Jonak as well. So, yeah, so in summation, I don't think it's the fact that they're speaking Korean that is the issue. I think it's that whatever personality or style or whatever they have, there's an extra hurdle where they have to cross the language gap. There's a bunch of Western players who have terrible personalities. Terrible personalities. I don't mean in the sense that they're awful human beings. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I mean at all. But there's a lot of players that have the personality of a fucking wet lettuce, and they're really popular with Western audience. Why? Because you don't have to cross that language gap as easily. You understand them. You resonate with them. Because a lot of our audience are kind of wet lettuce types where they're shy, they like their anime, they don't talk too much, they frag out, they play video games a lot, they like the same kind of things, they vibe with them. It's difficult to get that feel from somebody if you also have to cross the language barrier. It does add another barrier in the way to be able to interact. But I think it's so possible to still have very real connections from fans to players with that language gap. It just, the more marketable players will succeed more. And for example, guys like Gesture, like Bumper, like Haxel, like Stitch, like Sabiorbi, all of these players are fantastic examples. And for the Florida Mayhem, if they pick up some other people as well, they should be. Every team is looking for marketability, and marketability doesn't come down to really what language you speak. It comes down to how marketable the player is, whether or not they're fantastic and can ride purely off their skill, whether or not they will vibe with a certain demographic, whether that's by being cute or by being the bad boy or by being trash talky and the villain or by being really cool, whatever it is. Those are the things you take into account when you think about marketability and the connection with the fans, and that's what's going to decide the longevity of OWL from the team and player point of view. Okay, Pogey says, how do you take the Florida roster situation? Do you think this is the right move in having a fluent speaking system, or are they just shitting the bed with their PR and players? Also, what Korean players would you add to make this roster better? I think the Florida roster situation was the correct move for them. I think they are probably 3 or 4 moves away from being a very good team if they pick up the right people. They're 2 moves away from being a decent team, as in they can take wins off people and they don't just look like a trash can at the bottom of the league. And you can see the improvements that they're making already just based on the communication. But those improvements aren't enough. They do also have to make roster moves. But we've also spoken to Arhans. He was on one of our halftimes recently where he said that they will be making roster moves. They're looking at a couple of players from OWL. They're looking at players from different regions, Korean players from different regions, people who play in North America but are Korean and speak Korean, and also a lot of players in Korean contenders. So what Korean players would I add to make this roster better? I would add... on off tank. So I talked about needing somebody on off tank. I was interested in Doko, but it looks like the Atlanta Reign are going to stick with him. Okay, if you can get QOQ from Runaway, that would be a great pickup. If not, Bernard from Fusion Uni would be a fantastic pickup as well. I think those 3 players would be my top of my list to try and acquire. If you can shell out for them, then go for it. If not, you're going to have to dig a little deeper into Contenders Korea to find somebody that's a little hidden, a little under the radar. Which, I haven't been studying Contenders Korea trying to find a diva player. I'm sure there's somebody out there who would fit the bill, though. On main tank, I think there's a bunch of people in OWL right now that I would try and buy from OWL teams because they have that experience of being able to play at the top level. Or at the very least, understand what's required from playing in the Overwatch League. Fate would actually be a good acquisition that I think would even help the Valiant if they get money or it's part of a weird 3-way trade or whatever. It looks like the team was moving away from that very Korean focused structure with Moon and Fate as the team captain and the translator. So Moon, the head coach, translator, they have left. Fate seems like he probably has less power in the team now. I don't know whether he's really the acting team captain anymore. So if they're looking to make moves, the Valiant, which it seemed like they were for a long time, then maybe there's an opportunity for Fate to move over to the Mayhem. Other options of people on the bench are Axiom from the Boston Uprising. That guy speaks Korean. He's actually pretty talented. He's got a lot of potential. At the moment, it looks like they're running with fusions. I don't know whether Boston would really give up on Axiom, but they do tend to like to sell their players, so that could be a decent shout. No Smite from the Hangzhou Spark is, I think, probably doesn't have as much potential as Axiom and isn't as good as Fate, but is pretty decent and with the right coaching could be pretty good. But from what I've seen when he's played in Spark, he's had some weird moments as well. But it would still be a big upgrade, I think. And the others are like Panka or Smurf, actually. Panka's a 2-way player for the Gladiators. I could definitely see him being a player that Mayhem reach out to. I think that would be a good addition. I think Panka's good enough to have an opportunity in the Overwatch League and would be a developmental player for sure. Isn't ready to start on a top team, but Mayhem would be a good start for him. Or Smurf as well, who's on the San Francisco Shock. I'm not sure whether they're willing to give up Smurf, but the guy looked fairly decent. There wasn't that much difference on some of the maps when he played. Some of the maps, he was quite clearly worse than Super, but Super's actually improved quite a lot, so okay. Who else would I try and get? I think I'd be looking at... Guangzhou Charge have a guy that's just about to turn 18 called Rise, who used to be called 1J Lee, who I think would... I'm not even that low on Hagapyeon. I think Hagapyeon's actually pretty good. I don't mean pretty good. Like, I think he's towards the bottom. He, along with Guido, they're probably the bottom 2 Korean flex supports in the league. But you're already pretty decent if you're a Korean flex support in the league. And Hagapyeon's had success in the past. I'm not one of those people like Yiska, for example, who thinks Hagapyeon's just an unsavable bot. But If you wanted to upgrade that position, Rise or Wonji Lee from the charge would be a decent option. He turns 18 pretty shortly. Now, who else would they get on DPS? Because I do actually think you need to add another DPS. BQB and Sire Player are good, but they occupy somewhat similar roles within the team. And you don't really have anybody that plays a range of different kind of projectile heroes mostly. So I would be looking at Water from Gladiator Legion, which would be super interesting if they brought in Panka and Water. That could be really cool. Water's a guy that's been rising up through the ranks recently, got picked up by Gladiator's Region. He's pretty inexperienced, but very mechanically talented, would need a good coach alongside him. Don't know whether the Florida Mayhem would genuinely be the best place for him to develop. He might need a bit more time in contenders, but it would be cool to see him picked up at the very least. And we'd get to see what he was capable of on a roster that, if they made other improvements across the board, could be okay. Or you could try and go for someone like Wikid, who used to play for the Seoul Dynasty, and honest to God, wasn't that bad. His Genji was okay, his Junkrat was good, his Tracer was serviceable. He could be a good addition for this team, and he's pretty flexible. Tuba as well, a guy from Korean Contenders who's been around for quite a while, and is pretty flexible. Not the most flexible player in the world, but fills that projectile role, has the Pharah, has the Genji, this kind of stuff. And could add a bit of experience to the team. Now, this one's going to sound mental as well, but with the Justice shelling out to pick up Ark and Sleepy from two of the top teams in the league, it made me think, like, who else is on the bench from one of the top teams that is actually really good? Like, Ark was good, but because they didn't need him, they were willing to sell him. And probably because he actually wanted some game time as well, like Sleepy. So what about if they tried to buy Flower? I know, it sounds mental, right? But Flower isn't really going to see much game time on the NYXL, I think. When do you run him over Libero? I personally don't even think that Flower is worthy of the hype that he gets around the scene. He popped off in a World Cup and looked decent at IEM Kyangi in late... He looked good, to be fair. He looked really good at IEM Kyangi in late December 2016, or mid-December 2016. But after that, he didn't look that great. And also, they've got Pine to play the flashy stuff. They've got Libero to play the solid stuff. When does Flower come in? He doesn't fit the style of the NYXL as well. So this is a weird fit for NYXL, but it could be a fucking amazing fit for Mayhem. I mean, Flower alongside Sire Player and BQB, you've now got yourself a very dangerous DPS core. So yeah, those are some of the players that I would be considering, depending on, obviously how much money they have, who's willing to sell, this kind of stuff. The Leogend says, if there was one thing you could tell a viewer to pay attention to in a game to improve their understanding of what is happening, what would it be? Pay attention to the ultimates and try and predict what's going to happen in the fight before anything happens. And that will give you an expectation and context to then understand what movements people are making. So in my opinion, it should go ultimates first, positioning second, micro plays third. So first of all, how I perceive the game generally as a model is I flash my eyes up to the ults, I see what the situation is in the next fight. I think, okay, this team has this win condition, this team has this win condition. This team knows this team has this win condition, so they're probably going to play more aggressive. They're probably going to play more defensive. They're probably going to spread out, whatever it may be. And then once you have an idea of what the two teams are likely to be doing in the fight, you can watch the two teams approach, and you can see which team has the advantage in terms of positioning, which team trades bubbles or other abilities better, with that context in your mind of what both teams are trying to achieve. And the achievements, the win conditions in each fight are normally set up by the ults. So that would be my biggest thing to pay attention to, is try and learn how teams play when certain ults are online. Dip says, do you agree that Fusions has looked surprisingly good on non-Reinhardt tanks? And is colourhex with 41% crit accuracy on Widow a top tier DPS already? That 41% crit accuracy on Widow might have been a glitch, by the way, because when I looked at it afterwards, I got that he got like 30%. So I'm not so sure that that was actually accurate. I think something may have either gone wrong with the stats or may have not been contextualized or something like that, but okay. Anyway, let's tackle the second question first, because I was just talking about the crit accuracy. colourhex, I wouldn't call a top tier DPS already. I think the guy's got potential. I'm pretty high on colourhex, honestly, compared to a lot of other people. But the only thing that he's really shown us that was good so far was his Widowmaker. What else did he play, actually? He played Tracer with Blase on Pharah, which was weird to me, but I think it's because colourhex is better at both of those heroes, in my opinion. But Blase is probably pretty uncomfortable on the Tracer. But then also, Blase played a bit of Tracer later on. I don't really know what's happening with that, but they've got two kind of projectile DPSs. So it's a weird situation for Boston Uprising. But I would say the only thing that colourhex has looked really good on at the moment is his Widowmaker. But I think he could look good on Genji, on Pharah, on a bunch of different stuff. But I wouldn't say he's a top tier DPS. No, I think that would be jumping the gun. Do I agree that Fusions has looked surprisingly good on non-rein tanks? I mean, we've only seen him on Winston a few times, but he has played a bunch of Winston. And I was surprisingly impressed. We did see Fusions play Winston a long time back in, what was it, Contenders Season 1 or something like that? Like when they made it to the LAN finals and played against Fusion Uni and beat them with tanks and that kind of stuff. I think Fusions was playing for British Hurricane at the time and played Winston there for at least some portion of it. But it was so long, and he's developed so much as a player since then that I always had that question mark about it. Can he play well on the non-rein tanks? And I did think that he played surprisingly well. He was a smart Winston when I was watching him. He took positions nicely. He didn't overextend. He wasn't making huge plays. He wasn't dominating, and he wasn't able to have that kind of leadership role within the team as much. But yeah, it seems like the question mark of how well Fusions would play on Winston has, at very least, the answer is not that he's a Rein one-trick. The Leogend says, which player has been the most surprising to you this season so far? I would say Amon, actually, because I was very low on Chengdu coming into this because their main tank situation was fucked. Like, absolutely fucked. Let me remind you, Amon has never played, well, I say never, basically never played Winston in his pro career. He played like 10 minutes total ever in Contenders. That's who a team has starting for them in the league. And yet he's still able to have huge impact on Wrecking Ball because the team plays around him so well, and because the team knows his limitations and knows that he has to play Wrecking Ball, and therefore they craft styles around his Wrecking Ball. And he does really fucking well on the Wrecking Ball. And his Rein was a surprise after having been trashed for so long, the fact that he could play it to an okay level. Having said that, he hasn't brought the Rein out very recently, and they're kind of getting red as well. But certainly the style that they play with Jinmu being a hyper-aggressive, mechanically talented DPS, and then Amon on Wrecking Ball, Chengdu have definitely surprised me. Okay. Although Vancouver and New York... Dip says, although Vancouver and NYXL are undoubtedly top teams, they have been shown to at least have the potential to let the pressure get to them versus Chengdu and versus Seoul, respectively. In this way, could you potentially see Shock as a better team than them, seeing as they haven't really mentally boomed yet? All of their losses have still seen them playing excellent Overwatch. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that all of their losses have seen them still play excellent Overwatch. Shock lost to the Gladiators and played some terrible Overwatch, but that was right at the beginning of Stage 1, before they had really become an excellent team, before they figured out which roster to go with all the time and cemented that themselves. So, okay, I'll accept your premise, honestly. Shock haven't mentally boomed. They always play really good Overwatch, even when they lose. I'll agree that at the moment. They haven't been tested that much. The only top team that they've really played is the Vancouver Titans in Stage 1, right? Oh, no, actually, no, because of course they played Vancouver and they played New York in Stage 1, and both of those games they played good Overwatch as well. Okay, so yeah, your premise is pretty good. Shock are a very good team even in their losses. Vancouver versus Chengdu was weird, for sure. But I wouldn't say there's been any other time where we've seen them play poor Overwatch in a win. And obviously they have not lost yet. At NYXL, I think so your question is that could I see Shock as a better team than both Vancouver and NYXL? And my answer is I don't see Shock as a better team than Vancouver, because they directly lost the head-to-head matchup twice in series that were very long and kind of got a good read for where both teams were at. Nobody overperformed too much. Nobody underperformed too much. You played a bunch of different maps, a lot of different opportunities for teams to succeed or fail. And we saw where these teams shake out. And it is with Vancouver as the better team. Or at least it was throughout stage 1. Maybe Shock have improved, but I think they've just had, I think they've just been plowing lower level teams. It's difficult to tell. Now, NYXL, I do agree. They let the pressure get to them versus Seoul, versus Atlanta, and I definitely think that they are the worst of the top 3. They look most inconsistent, which is very strange, because NYXL's consistency was their strongest asset last season when they just dominated the regular season. But they did still give up matches here and there, like it's super difficult to be able to absolutely dominate and just clean run through it all. It's crazy what Vancouver are doing right now. So yeah, I agree with you, except that I would have Vancouver. I don't think the Chengdu close game was enough to say that Vancouver have the ability to let the pressure get to them. I think if Vancouver had been the kind of team to let the pressure get to them, they would have collapsed in the stage 1 finals when they were down 3-1. I think it was 3-1, right? Toxicinator asks, do you think there's a reasonable path to becoming an analyst in Overwatch, or is it time to start preparing to jump to the next game? I'm currently a university-age player, not extremely high-ranked, diamond or master, so no pro links, with a large interest in analysis and just beginning to think about this. Is the best route to analyzing esports on a professional level to prepare for the next big thing? Well, the two are not mutually exclusive. I would say, if you're deep into Overwatch and you're looking to try and become an analyst, it's unlikely that if you are starting right now, unless you have a meteoric rise and meet the right people, network in the right ways, push out the most incredible content, grind incredibly, have a stream that pops off, this kind of stuff, you are unlikely to make it within the next 2 years, I think, if I'm being brutally honest. From when I started making content in the scene in May 2016 to when I was invited to do anything that was officially Blizzard sanctioned was over a year. And that was right at the beginning of the game when I was essentially competing with very few people and there was nobody established in the scene. At the moment, there's a lot of people established in the scene and you're competing with a lot of people. So you got to be reasonable. If you're looking to get into analysis and this kind of stuff, don't expect it to be easy. For most people, it takes years. And I was doing stuff in TF2 for years. Like I've been doing analysis stuff since 2014. So 5 years now. And, I only made it to a paying job, 3 years in. Well, no, I was getting paid in 2016 as well, but I was just writing articles and stuff. But I only made it properly 3 years in out of the 5 that I've been doing it. So don't think that it's going to come easily. But the advice that I would give you is that preparing for the next big thing, the best way of doing that would be to create content and learn the ropes in whatever game you're currently trying to make it in. So I would advise you, even if you do end up moving on to the next big thing and trying to become an analyst in, say it was just when Fortnite released, trying to become a Fortnite analyst or an Apex Legends analyst, or hell, what's a game that's about to be released? I actually have no idea. I'm so out of the scene. But whatever, you know what I mean. Whatever the next big thing is, if you have a resume of stuff that you've done in a previous title, that can be really useful. Like it was for me when I came from TF2 into Overwatch. Very fucking useful, super useful, put me on the radar immediately. And even if you don't, even if the resume that you have doesn't help you, just the experience of creating that content will enormously help you. Your content and your analysis will be dog shit at the beginning. It will be really bad. Unless you are a pro player, and even then, you're probably going to be quite shit at being able to articulate your points and create good content. It takes time to be able to develop skills. It takes time to be able to develop writing skills, to be able to develop talking skills, to be able to develop thinking skills about how to model things effectively. I spent 2 years in TF2 only getting good at casting and occasionally writing. And I already knew how to write. I'd already been a good writer in terms of, schoolwork, or I wrote occasionally on the side as a hobby. And it was only after doing a shit ton of research into a bunch of different other people that do analysis stuff and thinking about, okay, I'm not trying to watch this to learn what they're trying to teach me. I'm trying to learn about how they think about it. Like, how did they come up with this stuff? What's important to them? What's their thought process like? What's their work ethic like? How do they operate mentally? And so just thinking about it takes time, and building those skills takes time. So just the best advice to anybody getting started in esports, whether it's casting, whether it's analysis, whether it's streaming, whatever, is start making the content. It will be shit. Don't be a perfectionist. That is the worst thing to do. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Remember that. So just make content, keep iterating on the content, because the two most important things are pushing out good content regularly and improving it. As long as you keep that cycle going where you are keeping on and pushing out content and it keeps getting better, you will eventually be pushing out content that is good enough that it will get noticed. It's just a natural course of it. And if it, for most of the people that haven't made it in the scene but have been pushing out a bunch of good content, it's because their content wasn't good. Just being real. Precoixious says, what makes you happy? Okay, what a fucking question. A bunch of things, honestly. I'm generally quite a happy person. I occasionally get down. I've had times in my life where I felt horrific. I alluded to it on a YouTube comment, actually. Someone was talking about when I got kicked out of med school, someone commented that they were going through a similar thing and were thinking of offing themselves. So I've never talked about my mental health before particularly, but you know, I went through a time where I was in a fucking terrible place mentally, which was way before I got kicked out of med school. Actually, it was like 2 years before I got kicked out of med school. I was in an absolute worst place possible. But apart from that weird 6 to 8 months of my life, I've and then the lessons that I've learned from being in that dark place, I'm generally quite a happy person, and I don't really think of it in terms of being happy. I think of it in terms of just being content. I think it's Epicureanism that talks about what is it, ataxia and aparaxia? I don't fucking know. Anyway, the point of the dumb Latin terms, which I hate Latin terminology, because if you understand the concept, the fuck does it matter if you use the right word? Okay, but the concept of Epicureanism basically is that you want to try and attain a lack of bad shit. You don't want things mentally to be going wrong for you. You don't want things physically to be going wrong for you, and you want kind of a hedonism that isn't so much about trying to get the most pleasure possible, but the least pain possible. The least mental and physical pain is the best way of putting it, basically. And the mental is more important than physical pain as well. I mean, some physical pain can be perfectly good, but you know, most mental pain is not that good. So I try and just live my life, roughly speaking, like that, where I try not to let too much affect me, don't take things too seriously, and try and maximize the opportunities to enjoy myself and minimize opportunities for my own suffering. But it's going to sound like such a cliche answer, but what makes me happy the most is I mean, this is the most cliche answer you could possibly ask for, but I'm going to go into a bit more detail. Is love, right? And not because I crave it, because I wasn't given any as a child. I was given a fuck ton of it. And I think I really appreciate it because I have such a tight family. Not tight in the sense that I tell my family everything, but I have a very close bond with everybody in my family, and I love them very much. And we do a lot of things together when we're back at home, and I have a very tight and stable family structure back at home as well. And it's something that I've valued more and more as I've, learned more about other people and about how difficult it can be if you don't have that structure at home and don't have that love available. And so that, I think, is something that I really value is when I go home, just that feeling of knowing that people really care for you. And it's the same, not just in that way, and not just like romantic love, obviously, which can be a fantastic feeling as well, but also just the platonic love of like deep friendships is what makes me very happy as well. I think Bren has a phrase that he occasionally comes out with, which is that what he values most in life is surrounding himself with people that he really enjoys hanging out with. And I'm like that to some extent as well. And throughout my life, I've normally had a range of people that I'm like okay friends with, and they're just like I normally have a big bunch of people that I'm pretty okay friends with, and you know, like I'll go out with any of them at any time. But during my own university years, and then after now that I've got into esports and stuff like that, I value deeper friendships much more. Like actually creating real connections with people is one of the things that makes me the happiest, because it's like being cared for. You know, once you get to that level with somebody, you're essentially entering a bond where you're connected in terms of your empathy. So anything that would be bad for them is bad for you. So you try and make their life as good as possible, and anything that is bad for you is bad for them. So they try and make your life as good as possible, and try and help you with the pain and stuff like that. So that is a huge deal to me. Is just human connection. I suppose is a better way of saying it than love. Although that's essentially what it is. It's empathy, compassion, and love at the end of the day. But you know, if you wanted a list of like shit that makes me happy, like I don't know, burgers or going walking or something, there's a bunch of stuff I like doing, but I could live without all of them. But what really makes me happy is like honestly working on projects and getting the sense of satisfaction from a project well done makes me happy. But mainly it's emotional connections with other people. Formation says, what's worse, no trash talk as players just shrug, or bad trash talk where the imagination is limited to some variant of you suck and you're bad lol? They're both pretty fucking terrible, honestly, Formation. Trash talk, if it's bad, I can still be okay with. But trash talk where players just shrug is, to me, just a fundamental misunderstanding of opportunities that are presented to you as a player. If I was running a team, one of the things that I would try and focus on so much with my players is opening their eyes to the fact that you just have an opportunity to big yourself. It doesn't matter if you're shit in the server. Okay, it matters if you're shit. But if you're mediocre to very good, the amount you can improve by your personal brand, like how much you are valued, how much you are paid, how much career success you have, how much longevity you have in the scene, all of that shit you can improve quite a lot by grinding, by trying to get better as a player. But you can improve it just as much, if not more, by taking advantage of the media opportunities that are presented towards you and bigging up yourself or creating a character for yourself or this kind of shit. Would anyone give a shit about Dogman if he wasn't the villain of the league and hadn't deliberately built himself up to be the villain of the league? I don't think so. He'd be another player from Contenders that gets playtime, like, for example, Kodak. Or, I mean, who else is in a similar position to him who plays flexible? I mean, Reaper, but Reaper doesn't get as much playtime. But you know what I mean? Like, if Dogman didn't have that personality behind him, he wouldn't be getting a lot of airtime, a lot of interviews, a lot of people talking about him, a lot of people, like, you know, thinking about him. Brand awareness is what it comes down to. It's marketing, it's advertising. Every time you get yourself on somebody's lips, every time someone says your name, you are then more likely to be thought about in the future. And that increases your stock because people think about you. Even if you're a fucking villain, that can be awesome. Even if you're like the bad boys, which, like, it's so silly. It's so, like, awesome but silly that Vancouver Titans are like the bad boys of OWL, because they talk a lot of trash, but they're such sweethearts, you know? And you can tell that they don't really, like, disrespect other teams. They don't hate them. It's just like, yeah, you know, it's the swagger that comes with winning a lot. They deserve it. But they're not the bad boys in the sense that people actually dislike them or have any beef with them or anything, you know? But all of that is just such an opportunity, and a lot of players really don't take advantage of it. And I think it's the number one thing that they don't take advantage of the most. Okay. I'm going to leave the rest until the next one. And I'm going to end the video there because holy shit, that's been a long video. My throat is hurting and I need to go and get a drink because everybody else is out at the bar. But okay, good talk, fam. Good talk. Peace.